Coming up, the past, the present, and the future of Braille at 200.
This is Double Tap, celebrating Braille at 200. Now, here's your hosts, Stephen Scott and Shaun Priest.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to a special week of Double Tap as we celebrate Braille at 200. Yes, 200 years old. Quite a milestone. And thankfully, between Shaun and I, we don't have 200 years of experience in anything, or indeed in life. Shaun Priest, how are you today?
I'm doing well, feeling very old now. But
no, you feel young, right? Because you're not 100 years old. That's good news, right?
Compared to Braille, I'm a young man. Thank you, Stephen Scott. Yeah, that sounds great.
That's the way we're going to. That's the way I'm measuring it today. Listen, I was thinking about how we approach this, right? Because there's been so much conversation that we've had on the show over the past year, over 2024. We've been talking about all the different aspects of Braille, its survival with technology, the gap between those who are being educated with Braille, those who aren't, and also the access to the equipment as well. And I felt this week we really need to tackle all of this with experts, people who know things.
Not us then. So we're off this week.
Yeah. Well, you are actually for most of it, because most of the conversations I've had. But I find expert. I'm not the expert, no, but I have got some great people this week that we're talking to. And I just thought this week would be a really nice time, especially with the anniversary of 200 years since Braille came to life because of Louis Braille. I thought it'd be a good opportunity for us to sort of dive into where we're at today. I don't want to focus too much on the historical aspects of it. I know a lot of people get into that. But I don't think that's really what we're about here. We want to talk about, and I especially want it to be from our perspective as well, Shaun, because you and I are later to Braille, right? I know you got a little bit of training on it years back. I did a little bit at school. But I don't know. I feel we need to talk about it from the point of view of people who are coming to Braille later in life. And for that reason, we're going to be talking about a lot of the cool ways that today you can get into Braille, and actually how technology is enabling more of us to access Braille, which I think is a really good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've talked about our concerns when it comes to the uptake of people using Braille before, and we're going to get into conversations about that with other people, I'm sure. But you're right. I mean, from where we are today, technology is everything to me. Everything in my daily living, and Braille should be a part of that. So how is that done through technology?
Yeah, I mean, look, in some ways, if you've got an iPhone, you've got access to a Braille display to some degree, or at least a Braille keyboard, I should say.
Braille keyboard.
I wish you had the Braille display. A Braille keyboard through Braille screen input, which is built into every iPhone. Braille back is built into every Android device. So, you automatically have the ability to write Braille. Reading Braille is a different story. And we're going to talk a little bit about some new technologies that are coming out, which I think have been quite interesting. We learned a lot last year about some rather cool tech that's coming out this year, possibly the year after. That's the thing with Braille, right? It's not a guarantee that everything's going to come out within 6 months of it being announced.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Look at Orbit, right? I mean, we've waited years for some products to come along. There's one product in particular I'm thinking about that I think might come out in particular this year that might, I think, attract a lot of us. We'll talk about that later, though.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, the Braille sector isn't alone in that, with long delays, but it seems that there is a lot of excitement recently. Braille has picked up from the tech's point of view. There's been the Hable one, for example, just picked up such huge enthusiasm. And I think there's other devices doing the same thing. Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk about all of that today. We're going to talk about some of that tech, that cool tech that's kicking around that is, either out now or is coming soon, that I think is going to make Braille even more popular amongst those of us like us who are in some ways new to Braille. And I think even for those people who are lapsed Braille learners, people who've learned it at school. Yeah. Because loads of people. This was another aspect to this I learned during the course of this conversation and over the course of the conversations coming up this week. Is the number of people who are lapsed Braille users, right? They learned at school, but they didn't stay with Braille. They didn't use Braille, and they're coming back to it later in life. And the technology is kind of making that possible. So yeah, lots to talk about. But I want to kick off really where it all began this week. And that is with Louis Braille himself. Now, of course, World Braille Day is a great opportunity to celebrate Louis Braille, but this year in particular, it is even more special, and that is because we honour the man who created the code, Louis Braille himself.
Imagine a world where the written word is out of reach. For centuries, blind people faced this reality. Then, in the early 19th century, a young boy from a small French village dared to change that forever. His name was Louis Braille. Louis Braille was born on January 4th, 1809, in a small village near Paris. He was the youngest of 4 children in a loving family. Louis's father was a harness maker, and like many children of his time, he enjoyed playing in his father's workshop. But one day, curiosity led to tragedy. At just 3 years old, he injured his eye with a sharp tool. The wound became infected, and within weeks, the infection spread to his other eye, leaving him completely blind. Despite this life-altering event, Louis's parents were determined to give him the best opportunities they could. He was bright, curious, and resilient, a spirit that would later drive his monumental achievements. At the age of 10, Louis was sent to the Royal Institute for Blind Youth in Paris, one of the first schools of its kind. Life at the institute was harsh. The building was poorly heated, the food was meager, and students were often isolated from the world around them. Yet Louis thrived academically. He quickly mastered his lessons and displayed a natural gift for music, becoming an accomplished cellist and organist. At the institute, blind students were introduced to a system of reading developed by the school's founder, Valentine Hauy. This method used raised print letters that could be felt with the fingertips. While innovative for its time, it had significant flaws. The letters were large and cumbersome, and reading was slow and exhausting. Writing, meanwhile, was nearly impossible. Louis and his peers knew that something better was needed. In 1821, when Louis was just 12 years old, a retired French army officer named Charles Barbier visited the school. Barbier demonstrated his invention, night writing, a code of raised dots and dashes designed for soldiers to read messages silently in the dark. While ingenious, the system was too complex for practical use by blind people. Still, it sparked something in young Louis. Determined to simplify and improve Barbier's system, Louis worked tirelessly in secret. By the age of 15, he had developed a new system based on 6 raised dots arranged in a rectangular cell. Each configuration represented a letter, number, or punctuation mark. This design was elegant, compact, and most importantly, practical. Louis called it Braille.
My name is Kay Holbrook, and I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia. I'm a fan of the man because of what he did. But in terms of Braille, the system that we use for reading and writing for people who are blind or visually impaired, I believe that this is the key to accessibility, the key to knowledge, the key to employment. And so my connection to Louis Braille is related to how insightful and clever and knowledgeable he was as a person in a very different age. I can't believe that as a young child in a time where this kind of thing was not accepted, really, he was able to go past that and to develop something that's really been lasting for over 200 years.
However, the road to acceptance was anything but smooth. The school's administration resisted change, preferring traditional methods. Some even dismissed Braille as unnecessary. Yet Louis continued to teach his system to other students, who quickly saw its advantages. He completed his education and returned to the institute as a teacher, where he quietly championed Braille. Tragically, his health began to decline in his late 20s. Like many of his time, he contracted tuberculosis, a disease for which there was no cure. Louis Braille passed away on January 6, 1852, at the age of 43. He never lived to see the full impact of his work. At the time of his death, his system was still not widely adopted, even at his own school. It wasn't until 1854, 2 years after his passing that the Royal Institute officially adopted Braille. From there, his invention began to spread, eventually becoming the universal standard for written communication for blind people around the world. Today, Louis Braille's legacy lives on, not just in his revolutionary code, but in the millions of lives it has empowered.
I guess the thing that I thought of immediately when you said his legacy is that it has stood the test of time. We just went through the last couple of decades. We went through a major revisioning of the code that we use for Braille, but it maintains the exact same structure that Louis Braille came up with when he was a child, and so I can't imagine. It's kind of like, for sighted people, it's kind of like print. We can't even really imagine a time when print didn't exist. And I think we're getting to that point in Braille as well. We, as advocates of Braille, have to be really careful that we don't let I was going to say ignorance, and I think that is a good word, of sighted people who don't understand the value of the Braille code take over the use of Braille. We have fought battles, and we will continue to fight battles of people who think that Braille is obsolete and that we don't need Braille because we can just listen to everything that we need to, every piece of information that we need to gather. But that's a very limited view of literacy. And so we have to be careful to maintain that legacy of Louis Braille and to make sure that it continues on for generations to come. And I believe it will.
Louis Braille's story is one of perseverance, creativity, and profound impact. A young boy from a quiet village transformed the world with 6 simple dots. His work reminds us that even in the face of great challenges, one person can leave a legacy that changes lives forever.
The rather remarkable story, I think, of Louis Braille there. And, I think it just encapsulates the awe that we have for a person in that time, just to think back to that time, to come up with something like that, and to go to his deathbed unaware that it was going to become this thing that we're talking about today, 200 years on. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? That, that it was invented then, and that nothing has come along to beat it, really. Let's be honest. Nothing has come along to beat it in 200 years.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is kind of tragic from one sense that, he didn't see the impact that it had. But at the same time, it's the same old story of, everyone else thinking they know what's better for someone else who's blind, and it's the blind person itself. It's us who know what works and what doesn't work. And he just did it. I mean, it's an amazing story.
It kind of sits alongside, in a different way, but it sits alongside, the white cane, the guide dog, all this technology that comes along that tries to improve upon it and change it. It hasn't. At its core, it is, if you think of, and I think of the very first time I actually touched Braille, it was on a Perkins Braille. That was the first time I wrote Braille.
Yeah, of course.
Created it. And, that technology has been around for a very long time as well, right? So it's kind of incredible to think that legacy continues today in pretty much the same form. Yes, as we heard from Kay Holbrook there, there have been changes to it. The Unified English Braille Code has come in, and I am not even going to touch that because I have heard the controversy around that. I remember sitting in a Braille class with some people who were just not happy about UEB at all. But that's really the biggest change to Braille in decades. But it's a very interesting thing. And, Kay brings up so many interesting points. She talks about the connection that we make between Braille and literacy and Braille and employment.
Yes.
And these are 2 themes that are going to come out a lot this week in our conversations, because I want to question in particular the employment question, but also the literacy question. We've been talking about this a lot on the show.
Dangerous ground, Stephen Scott.
Well, we're going to get into all this on the show this week. Lots of interesting topics to come. We're going to be talking with Elizabeth McCann. She's a teacher of visually impaired children. She's based in Scotland, but she's worked around the world, including Canada, and most recently she was out in Jakarta. So we get a really interesting take on the availability of Braille teaching around the world. We're going to be focusing on the US in particular with Kate Crohan this week as well. She is also a qualified teacher of visually impaired children based at Perkins School for the Blind. She's going to be talking to us about her experience. She is blind herself, so she's a Braille user herself. She talks about her love for the code, but also how she teaches it. And not just to children, but to adult learners as well. And that's important to talk about because I think there's an emerging market, I think you might want to call it.
Sadly, yes.
Yes, unfortunately in some ways, yeah. But it is. It's an emerging market.
Well, I would say that's the majority, isn't it? I mean, blindness and visual impairment comes to most people, later in their life. So, I mean, that is, and the conversation we've had, Stephen, about, I just feel like I'm too late for the Braille train, I'm never going to pick it up to a speed where I want. Maybe that's not the case.
I think there's another side to it, though, isn't there? And I remember Negative Julian got in touch with this point, which I thought was a really pertinent point, which is, you've just figured out that you've just been told you're losing your sight.
Yep.
And no one at that point is thinking, oh, well, hand me those Braille books. Let me get started. Yes. No one's thinking that. Let's be honest. No one is. And you may never. Also, old age does not come alone. So if you are older, you may have other issues. You may have other challenges. You could have physical issues that preclude you from learning Braille. There are many people. I mean, a good friend of ours is a rock climber. He's completely destroyed his fingers over the years with rock climbing.
That's right.
So he's not going to be able to. I mean, although he is kind of figuring it out. But, the point is that it doesn't, Braille is not the answer for everybody.
No, that's right. And you just can't assume that everyone can just pick it up either.
But I do want to focus a little bit on that adult learning because we've had a lot of conversations about this, and I feel there's been a shift in the last 5 years, and a really positive shift. I remember when you and I used to talk about Braille, I often thought of it as a very dusty thing, as a little bit of a secret society almost. And it was almost a little bit exclusive. People would talk in a way about Braille as, you would sit and read War and Peace of a Sunday afternoon and kind of enjoy yourself. And
no, absolutely right. Yeah, it did have that feeling of being old-fashioned.
And look, for those people who do want to sit and read World War and Peace, if there is a World Peace book, War and Peace on a Sunday afternoon, great, enjoy it. Absolutely, why not? If you've got that skill, if you can read at a speed to be able to do that and enjoy it and get the most out of it, fantastic. But for a lot of us out here who are either new to Braille or new to blindness and want to get into Braille, I think the use of Braille is a different thing. It can be available differently to us, I think. It can be useful to us in a different way. And that's something I've started to see more conversation about. Now, back in 2022, we talked to Hadley. And at that time, Hadley had just started a new course, a Braille for Learners course, which was really about using Braille in everyday life. And we were so lucky to have Kim and Douglas Walker, both from Hadley. They're no longer at Hadley, but they were there at the time and they helped create this course. And we also heard from Karen Bright, who started learning Braille because she had lost her sight later in life. Let's listen back to that conversation in 2022.
What we were seeing is we were having such high dropout rates, and that's never good. So we started to survey and do a little research on, why. And we heard things like, well, it was overwhelming. And we know Braille can be overwhelming. A lot of people said, I didn't know what to do with the materials. There were so many materials. And then I felt like I was alone. I was very afraid to start to learn Braille. And a lot said, I really just, I don't want to read books. I just want to be able to read room numbers, the elevator, maybe make some labels. So we started with that. We really started with our learners and what we were hearing about what they didn't want and what they did want. And then, of course, Hadley is steeped in, best practices for teaching. So, of course, we always have that in mind when we develop any workshop. So that's how we looked at it and said, we need a change. We need to start from scratch and deliver to our learners what they're asking for.
Another problem that we were having was actually with the audio delivery of it. That was a huge reason for some of the dropout rates that we were seeing. We were using the National Library Service for the Blind's player and the cartridges there. And so, again, remember that these are people that are new to vision loss that are coming to us, And so what we found is that they want to learn Braille, and then boom, they're suddenly having to learn this new player and learn to listen and all that stuff, which they still have to do with this new one. But they were just overwhelmed by the amount of information coming at them. And, me, I'm a Braille reader, and I learned later in life. And for me, there's the emotional aspect of it is huge for the learners. And this is true for me. I mean, two of the hardest things, I guess, to embrace as somebody that gets to the point where they need Braille is the use of the cane was very difficult for me, but also admitting that maybe it's time to need some Braille for labeling things. And, I think it's you're admitting at that point that, hey, I'm blind, and that can be a tough thing. So the emotional part of it was part of the dropout rates too. And they were throwing so much material at them at one time, that we really had to address that.
I definitely think the word acceptance is good, and acceptance is two different things, because always I'm healing, my brain is healing different. My vision is fuzzy, and every day people will say, "Are you seeing better?" And that question can be just awful sometimes. I'm like, but stop asking me that. Or I love answering. It just depends on my mood that day. Just when I called that number and someone answered the phone and said, I think his name was Steve. And he just said, hello. And I was like, is this Hadley? What is this place? And then it meant someone was listening, someone was there. And I don't know, gave me hope, and that there was something I would be able to do on my own without my husband having to do it for me, or without having to call a friend or my mother or my dad or my sister, So that was huge. It's too daunting, I think, to assume you're going to be able to read a huge novel. But at the same time, I did realize when, we have hurricanes here in Wilmington and the power goes out, I am now so codependent on technology. And I was like, when there's no power, I have no means of taking in content at all. If there's no electricity and no Wi-Fi, and I want a way to be able to do that independent of audiobooks and Audible and all that. So I would ultimately like the idea of reading novels, but that's a very long-term goal. I love the idea of the short, let's take it one step at a time. The way I watched my daughter during COVID in kindergarten learn the word is for a full week. They built is with Play-Doh. They wrote the word is 10 times, and I said, okay, that's how we'll do Braille. The kids learned to read this way. It had been so long since I had learned to read. I didn't realize we didn't learn to read as easily as we thought we did. It's a difficult thing to do. They only send ABC, one book, and you can choose to watch the videos on the website, or you can call the number and they will do the lessons over the phone. So I use my iPad and watch the videos, and it's so simple with the voiceover. It's a 20-page book, ABC. Each page is one video, which works with voiceover. You just swipe next. So, and you have satisfaction at each page, A, learn the A. Next page, how many A's are on this page? Next page, feel the difference between A and a full Braille cell, which is, 6 dots of the dice. And they go through that in the very first lesson. But they do it very, very simply. And so you have success at the end of each video and the end of each page. And the videos are like 1 minute per page. And so you're never daunted or feeling, is that a word? Feeling daunted. I don't know. My daughter's kind of done it with me alongside. Of course, she's sighted, and 6. So she's like, I'm already done. Yeah, she's very good at it.
That's Karen Bright there talking about learning Braille with the Hadley course, the everyday learning course for Braille that they do and have been running now since 2022. It's a really, really cool course, Shaun, because, and it's so vital that we say this.
Yeah.
Learning Braille is a challenge, right? It's difficult especially when you're older. It's simple because your brain just can't take it all in, along with everything else you've got to remember and learn and deal with vision loss and everything else at the same time, right?
But there's so many good points raised there, right? I mean, acceptance is part of it, but there's also that fear of just, it's another thing to learn. And, especially if it's later on in life, can I even do it? But as you mentioned, I think the Hadley course, I don't know what it is. I mean, I think it goes back to kind of what you mentioned earlier as well, about the feeling of, or the perception of Braille being old-fashioned and sort of dusty. And some of the training materials that I've tried in the past just reinforce that. And there's courses like the Hadley organization that just totally, this just puts it into context for me, how this can help me every day,
It does make me think, though, I think part of it's because we get paper. It's like, paper? Really? And of course you need paper, right? Because that's what the Braille's printed on, right? There's no way around that. But there is something kind of like old-fashioned about it. But I can't download an app and do this. Well, but no, you need to feel it, right? That's the whole point. So it does have a kind of an old feel to it, I think, that is what I often kind of.
Well, maybe it is just that. Yeah, maybe it is just the fact that it is paper. Maybe that has something to do with it. But it's more like the materials that you read. I'm thinking of the fingerprint course here in the UK that a lot of us have used in the past for the last God knows how many decades. I don't know. It just feels like, is this a kid's story? And it doesn't feel like this is really relevant to me. Whereas, as we've talked about it, how many of us read a book? I never read War and Peace even when I could see.
Exactly,
so it's not going to entice me in, but being able to read the what's in my freezer or other labels and things is important to me. So it's all contextual and all about being relevant to us.
And it is important to, again, for people who are perhaps coming to the show who are learning a little bit about Braille today, they've never really understood much about it. They don't understand the history of it, learning about Louis Braille and everything else. I think it's important to recognize that this approach to Braille that Hadley's taken, and now other organizations have done the same, Braillists Foundation in the UK, the CNIB, the RNIB, other organizations around the world have taken on this approach now of, yes, we have got these Braille courses where you can learn to read Braille as a child, and qualified teachers of visually impaired children will teach Braille, and it will be intense, as it should be, because you're a child, you're learning this for educational purposes, potential for, going into employment and all of that. And we'll, of course, touch on all of this later in the week. But for those of us who are older, it's more about those everyday things, like labeling. And, Karen made such an interesting point when she said, I just want to do things independently of my husband.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to constantly be saying, what's this or what's that? And look, we've talked about how technology can help as well in that way, right? You can use the phone with Seeing AI or look out on, you know, Android, or, you know, and you can use cool apps to do a lot of this stuff as well. But, you know, it isn't just about that. It's about being able to label your own products. You've made something or you've put something away, and I've got like a box of batteries in there, and I can never remember which one's got the double A's in it versus the one that's got the triple A's.
Yes, that's
you know,
right.
just a simple label on the top, you know, just makes life just a little bit quicker. Means I don't have to ask or double check or wonder.
Yes, or that nest of cables underneath your desk and plugs in those extension leads, you know, and you can't always get down there to see what they are using Seeing AI or whatever smartphone app you want to use, but you could feel a Braille label on there, you know. There's so many practical uses.
I don't know if you ever got this. When I was growing up, I always felt a bit of snobbery around Braille. And that was kind of where I think that the issue came for me, was that it was almost like if you couldn't read War and Peace on a Sunday afternoon, you know, and have it finished by tea time, then you were a failure. And I had that feeling a lot growing up. And I often felt, and there's a little bit of in our community, there's a little bit of, you know, you're not quite good enough until you've got Braille, until you've got a guide dog, until you've, you know, there's like almost like,
it's like
levels you
up.
need to unlock.
Yes, that's right.
And then you win the game, right? It's like, hey, I'm totally blind now. Great.
I'm king blind. Yes.
That's right.
No, I think you're right. And look, I mean, it's not just Braille. In any community, you know, you have different personalities and different levels of what people think you need to get on. But I think, you know, I do think at the foundation level, everyone recognizes that Braille is important. And yes, we've talked about on this show the concerns that we have regarding Braille, but that's exactly because we do realize how it should still be in use.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I want to talk about some of the tech that people are getting into, especially when you've started this process of learning, or even if you haven't. And there's one device in particular which still surprises me to this day. And I bring it up because it's such an interesting little device, and it has captured the attention of many, many people. And I know there are people who've bought this who are not Braille readers, who are not Braille users at all, but they've bought this device to control their smartphone, and in a kind of roundabout way started learning Braille. And that's the Hable 1. Let's hear from its founder and creator, Freek van Velsnes.
This is a company with two co-founders, so two people that founded the company. It's me and my co-founder Ayushman. And Ayushman comes from India, and from a very young age he lived together with his grandfather. And at a later stage in his life, his grandfather lost his vision. So really from a personal experience with working with his grandfather, reading the newspaper, doing day-to-day jobs, he really found out that all the struggles that also came with this. And one of the big things was using his phone. So really from that point of view, Ayushman decided, hey, maybe there's something I can do about this, or maybe it's something I can develop. And he came up with some ideas that were like, by now we call them really shitty prototypes, is what we like to call them. And that kind of developed over time. So from that first initial idea, it developed with 50, 100 prototypes. So we started testing with multiple users. And that now came to this final product of the Hable 1. Braille, of course, is something that's being used less and less nowadays. But on the other hand, Braille is also something that really brings a lot to people. So we done our research, and we found out that Braille is really, if you look at people with blindness that are familiar with Braille or that use Braille, the employment rate is much higher. Often other statistics really say that Braille brings a lot of great things. But the problem is that Braille is a bit old and boring. So we thought, okay, let's see why Braille is so good for people, but why not a lot of people tend to use it. And we tried to make Braille a bit more new. So we kind of put it in a new code, as we like to say. And we really focus on the good parts of Braille and want to bring it to a wider audience. So yeah, it is a Braille keyboard, but actually right now in the Netherlands, almost half of our users don't actually know Braille. So they got the Hable 1 really as a easy and simple way to navigate over the phone. And in the meantime, some of them decided to learn Braille and others even just stick with the navigation part. But it's really a new way of looking at Braille. That was the concept behind it. Braille, familiar with Braille, of course it's a great device because it's really something that's just handy and on the road you can use it a lot. But when you're not familiar with Braille, there's a lot of things that are actually super useful. Just making that navigation over your phone a lot simpler. Instead of using that flat screen interface, you now have physical buttons. So we really also aim at that group. And to be completely honest with you, that's not how we once started. So once we started, we really thought it would be Braille keyboard for Braille users. But we kind of learned over time that this is something that you can learn really fast. So everyone, for example, that comes into our team, into our company, they first have to learn to work with the Hable one, sighted or non-sighted. And most of them didn't have any Braille knowledge. But in a few hours, you get the complete basics and you can already type. And it just takes a few more days to have a decent speed.
Now, I mean, that device has really captured the imagination of a lot of blind people. I remember you and I getting very excited testing it out of one particular night, I remember.
Just going to say that, texting each other back and forth. I'm using the Hable. So am I. Yeah, exactly. It's so strange. And look, I remember using an app called Braille on the iPhone. Before Braille input was a thing on both Android and iPhone, there were apps that you could would allow you to enter text using a Braille keyboard on the screen. And I remember, typing messages and emails using Braille input on my iPhone while I was traveling to a training course I was doing at the time. And it was just so much easier than trying to use the on-screen keyboard with the screen reader. It just was. It was quicker. And after a while, it feels fluid. And I remember having that same feeling with the Hable one when I was trying it out. And absolutely correct. Within a few hours, it feels comfortable. It's such a strange device. I don't know what magic sauce they use to do it, but it does feel really comfortable to use.
Yeah, and like I say, a lot of people buying it who are not Braille readers or Braille users in any way, right? So they've never maybe touched Braille, they've never typed Braille, but all of a sudden they're kind of figuring it out as they go. I think because it almost acts, the Hable one almost acts as a remote control for your phone, and that's what draws people in. So it's like those physical buttons. You get a chance to control your device. A lot of us are looking for that with our smartphones because, let's be honest, using a touch screen is not always easy for a lot of people. I mean, I'm talking to you today about this as, I sit here with my own issues, physical issues in my hands with the tremors that I have.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of looking for new ways to engage with my touchscreen device.
And it's smaller than a standard traditional Bluetooth keyboard. You have to worry about. You can easily slip it in your pocket. It does work well. Of course, we've had advancements in Braille input in smartphones since then, but still having that physical option, it just gives you another choice. It's great.
Yeah, well, we look forward to seeing what happens with Hable down the road. There's talk of a Hable 2, but we haven't heard anything more since it was kind of unofficially announced on our show.
After you interrogated him.
Yes, as I did my typical Stephen Scott of when will Hable 2 be coming out? But it hasn't surfaced yet. But apparently when it does surface, it's going to have a lot of cool and interesting new features. I think they're currently wanting to add everything to it.
I thought about that interview from Zero Project, I believe we spoke to them at, was that they were testing all these different things, and they weren't just going to rush out on the success of the Hable 1 and just, bring out a slightly improved version. They were looking for the reason for the next version. And I think that's a good thing. So when they do release the next one, there's going to be a good reason to do it.
Well, look, these devices aren't cheap, right? I mean, and there's certainly, you're not going to buy a new one every month or a new one every year necessarily.
No, of course not.
And there's no perhaps reason to either. I mean, ultimately, it's an input device. It's a keyboard to all intents and purposes. So, you don't have to, I mean, unless you're Stephen Scott and you go out and buy a new keyboard every week just for the sake of it, you don't need to do that.
Different color. Yeah, why not?
That's right. Oh, it's available in red. I'll have 2. But no, I think it's a really interesting device, but it kind of, as Freak himself has said, it kind of, he wanted to make Braille cool. And I'm seeing this with other devices as well. And another one that came to mind when we were putting this together was the BT Speak Pro, which has become very interesting in our community because it kind of takes it to another level. So this isn't an input device in the same way of the Hable 1. This is kind of its own little world in itself. It goes back to the days, it's got a kind of retro feel for a lot of people who remember devices like the Braille and Speak back in the day.
Yeah.
But this is something which is very much now of the moment. It's using Raspberry Pi technology. And it was really interesting. We caught up earlier in the year with David Goldfield, who's working for Blazy Technologies, who sell the BT Speak Pro.
You can't really talk about the history of what's behind the BT Speak without talking about the Braille and Speak and Blazy Engineering. So this all started back in the late 1980s, 1987, Dean Blasey released the Braille and Speak and started Blasey Engineering. And the product, really took off, and we had a very enthusiastic and worldwide user base. And it did really well, and the product grew, and we added a lot of features to it. It was very different, even from other products at the time, because it was extremely compact for its time, and it was very small, it was very light, and it was very intuitive. And that product, the last update for that came out in 2002, after Freedom Scientific was formed. And eventually they replaced it with other products. And of course, the Braille and Speak, while there are a lot of users out there, it's not available anymore. So all that being said, Dean Blasey and one of his sons, Brian Blasey, were talking about this 4 years ago. And they said, I wonder if we could make a modern day Braille and Speak out of a Raspberry Pi. And some of your listeners may be familiar with that, and some of them might not have. That's okay. But the Raspberry Pi is a very small computer that runs the Linux operating system. And you can use it to connect to other peripherals and devices and learn about how computers are programmed and built. And it's very inexpensive. And so they were wondering, okay, wait, could we take this Raspberry Pi and put a Braille keyboard on it and make it look, and put special software on it to make it look and act like an old Braille and Speak? Can we do it? And is there a need for it? Would people still want it? And I think now, after the 4 years that they have invested in developing and testing, I think the answer to both questions is definitely yes. And so the BT Speak is the result of that. And it is very compact. It's actually more compact than a Braille and Speak, if you can believe that. It is similar in its dimensions to an iPhone 14 or 15 Pro. So maybe a tad bit thicker. So if you can imagine something as small as a 14 or 15 Pro, it's 6 inches across, it's 2.8 inches front to back, and it's about 3/4 of an inch thick. And so we call it a pocket computer because you could probably comfortably fit it in most pockets if you really wanted to do that.
David Goldfield there from Blasey Technologies talking about the BT Speak Pro. Now, I'll be honest, this is something which I think is very much for, I think, the retro, but also the geeks who are really wanting to get into, programming and,
geeks,
just
dare
play.
you, Stephen.
Well, I think it is. And I think it kind of shows the breadth here. That's what I'm kind of wanting to showcase with all of this. It's like, on one hand, you've got a device like the Hable 1, which is kind of for everybody who, can go out and get this device and then, get access to Braille, even if you don't know it, all the way up to, this device, which is, I think for people who are a bit more advanced, and people who are even wanting to just get into the world and develop and use Braille, even though it doesn't have a display on it, it does have that input of the 6 dots that we've become used to, the Perkins-style Braille input keys.
Well, I mean, as David admitted himself, look, this all came from nostalgia, if you like, the love of the Braille and Speak back in the day, and seeing, let's bring it, drag it, screaming and kicking into today's technology with the Raspberry Pi, put it in a form factor of that size of an iPhone 15. It's amazing. And I think you're right, it does run Linux, and you can hobbyist around with it a little bit. I think it's a very cool product. Again, just another example of a new packaging for Braille in a new technology. I love it.
We have to, of course, talk about the next big moment for Braille, which kind of started many years ago, actually. It's not new, but it's starting to be realized this year and in 2024. and that is multi-line Braille displays. We're starting to see the deployment of these in more places. We're starting to see them become realized as actual products rather than just prototypes and things we've heard talked about for many years.
Concepts.
Yeah, well, I mean, and look, this is not uncommon in our world, right? It takes a long time. I mean, look at the BT Speak Pro. There 4 years it took to get that together.
Yeah.
It takes a long time for these products to emerge. But a huge amount of research and development goes into that, right? But one in particular, which has kind of stood out in 2024, was the Monarch from Humanware, which is co-designed with the American printing house for the blind. And it's a really interesting device. We're going to hear from Andrew Flatres now, who talked to us about this. We had Andrew recently on the show, and while we were talking to him, I asked him about the Monarch to give us a bit of a sense of what it's all about. But I also wanted to quiz him on cost, because look, we've talked about the education, we've talked about the devices, but there is a gap developing between both, and that is the cost itself. And I wanted to quiz him on his thoughts on the costs of Braille technology and how much of a help or hindrance new developments in this space could be, and how this would be impacted in a multi-line world, right, where the costs arguably go way over the top.
Yes.
Because instead of having a 40-cell display, you maybe have 200 cells on there. How do you keep those costs down? Here's Andrew Flatres from Humanware to talk about that, but also to kick off to talk about the Monarch itself.
So the Monarch is a dynamic tactile device. It can display 32 characters wide, 10 lines down, and it uses technology of equidistant pins, which means that we can display both Braille and tactile graphics on the same display. So something that's really unique to the Monarch itself. But it's generally a standalone machine. You don't need to connect it to a computer. You can do all of your kind of STEM work, word processing, accessing the internet. We'll soon have the email support come in as well in the next update early next year. You can create graphs in real time. And that's one of the biggest barriers that we face today in school. A young student is unable to create graphs in real time without having to get their wiki sticks and bump-ons, and then of course they just fall off. We are in the 21st century. We need modern technology to really assist those that want to be involved in things like maths and science. There comes a point, I think, at a certain age where they don't take it on because it's not as fun anymore, or they don't enjoy it, or they just face a lot of barriers. And hopefully Monarch will certainly overcome those barriers and allow them to continue their education journeys in subjects that they love, like maths and science. So it's come a long way, the Monarch, but you can access tactile graphics, an online demand tactile graphics library called the TJL. And that's another thing that we face today, is the lack of tactile graphics. They say on average you'll probably review 25 tactile graphics a year. That's what we're hearing from American Printing House, because of the cost that it takes to do them, the time, and the time to fingertips. A lot of the students go without all of these resources. And I'm sure many teachers that may be listening to your show have come across where you've planned all your material and next minute the teacher then changes the subject. Well, hopefully Monarch will overcome that barrier and you can do a lot of impromptu learning situations.
Yeah, see, I often talk about the broad question of cost, especially of a device like this, because it's such an expensive device. And I imagine at the moment you're kind of aiming this at education markets, possibly business as well, rather than the consumer. I mean, if someone can afford it, then great. But ultimately, it's probably not a consumer device at this stage. You'd agree with that?
Totally agree. That's always the issue that we face with all technology nowadays in assistive technology. It is expensive, and we know that it's expensive. And there's two ways you could look at this. Okay, so of course you've got the traditional piezo technology, which are traditional Braille displays like the Mantis. And that is very expensive technology. I mean, cells are on average about $25 to $30 a cell. Now, the technology that we're using is from a company in South Korea called DOTS Incorporation. And they are using different technology that allows us to display tactile graphics in Braille. And that is a little bit more affordable, but nevertheless, it still makes the price higher because you've got more cells. So if we were to put piezo cells on this device, it would have been a lot more expensive. And we're quite proud actually on the price point. And the price point, just so that we're transparent here, is just under 14,000. But let's think about the days when we first introduced Braille cells or Braille displays. They were £20,000. A lot of money in those days. And so to get where we are today, having in total of we've got 320 Braille characters on the display. I mean, how much would you pay for that on a display itself? So we're very proud on that price point. We'd love to get it down, of course, but of course our industry is so small, and we'd love, if you've got any listeners out there, Stephen, that want to sponsor us or sponsor a device, we're very much interested in trying to cut down that price point. Maybe a donation for each Monarch given to a child would be fantastic. But hopefully, once we get more and more Monarchs out there, we start driving that price point down.
Yeah, but one thing I love about having this conversation, and you wouldn't believe the amount of emails I get, Andrew, people who tell me, and I'm talking companies. I mean, the interesting thing is I don't get pushback from companies like you at Humanware. I get pushback from listeners who say to me, don't discuss this, don't talk about this issue. These companies are doing great work. They cost what they cost, get over it, pay the money or don't. And I disagree with that a little bit. I think, no, look, we need to have a serious conversation here, because if you want to talk about the longevity of Braille and it continuing on for another 200 years, you've got to talk about cost and you've got to talk about access to education for Braille. You've got to talk about those two things, because to me, I'm seeing the gap widen. Now, yes, you're right. The cost has come down. There's no denial, but it's still high. But there is another perspective on this, and you just gave it there, which is that for teachers in the real world who are spending time and effort building resources to have them change at last minute, meaning essentially that's all out the window, we've got to start again. How much money does that cost? We maybe don't measure it in dollars, but we measure it in hours and minutes, but it's still a cost.
With the American Printing House being the biggest distributor of Braille books, they know some of these metrics. And so when you look at an algebra book, for example, you're probably looking on the region of $20,000+ to actually build, to actually start creating, to bind them, to send them out.
One
book. So there's your return of investment. So just the one book will pretty much give you a return of investment. So obviously we'd love to speak with those in the Ministry of Education here in the UK, where the funding isn't as great. When we look in America, the American funding system is actually brilliant, and they've actually received more funding available from the Congress, where they're planning to distribute Monarchs to all blind children. That is the goal, and we would love to reach that goal here in the UK, but we've got to get past that funding barrier, which, as we know, is being reduced year after year, and that's really saddens me, because that means the lack of technology going into the hands of people that need this product.
Wow. Okay, let me say this, Stephen. Very brave of you to bring up the cost conversation in there, but I got to say I'm impressed with Andrew. Very candid about the pricing. And you're so right. We do need to talk about cost. And every time we talk about it, it's almost like we feel guilty for bringing it up, because we don't want to almost put at risk these companies, because we know we need their devices.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult conversation to have, but one that we should have. And I think Andrew was great there. I've got to say, well done.
But I think he gave us an interesting perspective. I mean, again, this is why these conversations are important, because they bring to light all of these aspects. Like, for example, in school, one algebra book and the cost, $20,000 to produce. And if that book changes or a new book comes along, it's another $20,000.
No. How many times have you had a photocopied sheet at school and there's a load of mistakes in there? And it's,
Yep.
I mean, that happens, right? It takes a lot to proof these things. I mean, the counter argument to that is, how on earth does it cost $20,000 for one book for binding and producing in either tactile or Braille form? But I mean, these are the costs that we're working with right now. It's hard to argue against them.
So we're going to be delving into all of this in a lot of detail over the next week, and we're going to be joined by some great guests, as I mentioned earlier. But before we go, I just want to quickly mention one other honourable mention, and that is to Kevin Chow, who was at the Vista Centre for the Blind earlier in 2024 and got the chance to get hands-on with a rather interesting little device that I think we will be talking about a lot in 2025. especially if it comes to fruition. And that is a Braille keyboard, but with a Braille display for your iPhone.
This was probably the most interesting thing. It was like a hidden gem in kind of everything because it wasn't listed as one of the vendors that was going to be there. But it's an 8-cell Braille display with the standard 6-dot and enter and backspace and spacebar keys. USB-C port, and the best part is MagSafe onto the back of your iPhone. So it's one of the coolest MagSafe accessories I think out there, personally, for blind people. And it's supposed to connect to Braille HID through Bluetooth. It was more of a prototype. They didn't have working software on it, so I wasn't able to see it live in action, but I was able to feel it and see how it connected. And it's no thicker than an iPhone, so I was able to slip it in my pocket to feel kind of how it felt, and it was pretty comfortable.
And that device is called the Pocket Dot, and that is one I'm going to be looking out for in 2025, no doubt. Listen, that's the past, the present, and the future right there in the last hour of Braille, but we're going to get into the nuance over the next few episodes, so do stay with us for some, hopefully rather interesting and thought-provoking conversation coming up from our guests over the rest of the week. Shaun, you're back with us on Friday, and we're going to be talking all about what everyone else is thinking and saying about this as we dive into the feedback. So join us for that on Friday's episode with Shaun. I'll catch you guys tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye-bye.